Welcome to Omas True Stories. This is the story of Chidi Adia. In the small, quiet town of Umwaka, Chidi walked home from the market, the hot sun beating down on his back as he thought about his late father, who had been the pillar of their family. He entered his home to find his mother, Ijeoma, sitting in the living room, her eyes quickly darting away from her phone as if she was hiding something. Chidi noticed her unease but brushed it off, attributing it to the stress of running the household alone since his father passed away. However, as days passed, Chidi began to notice his mother receiving secret phone calls and leaving the house late at night, her behavior growing more suspicious with each passing day. One evening, Chidi followed his mother discreetly as she left the house, curious to uncover where she was going so late. To his shock, he saw her meet with Emeka, his late father's closest friend, in a secluded part of town, exchanging intimate glances. Chidi's heart raced as he hid in the shadows, watching in disbelief while his mother and Emeka embraced, unaware of his presence. His mind swirled with questions. How long had this been going on? What would his father think? And how could Emeka betray his own wife, Ngozi, like this? Chidi felt his world crumbling as he quietly made his way back home, unsure of what to do with the weight of what he had just witnessed. He lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, as images of his mother and Emeka replayed in his mind, the betrayal cutting deeper than he ever imagined. The next day, Chidi tried to act normal, but the weight of the secret bore down on him, and he found it hard to meet his mother's eyes. Ijeoma, seemingly unaware of what Chidi knew, went about her day as usual. But every time she spoke to him, he felt a surge of anger and confusion rise within Chidi, went to visit his close friend, Obina, Emeka's son, trying to distract himself from the burden of the secret, but the guilt weighed on him heavily, as Obina laughed and joked. Completely unaware of the affair between his father and Chidi's mother, Chidi felt a pang of betrayal toward his friend as well. As the day went on, Chidi's mind raced with thoughts of what to do. Should he confront his mother, tell Obina the truth, or should he remain silent and let the betrayal continue? Every option seemed to tear at him, and the weight of the decision threatened to break him as he realized that no matter what he did, things would never be the same again. At night, Chidi couldn't take it anymore. He decided he had to confront his mother and demand answers, no matter how painful the truth would be. He found her sitting alone in the living room, and with a heavy heart, he approached her, his voice trembling as he asked, "Why are you doing this?" Ijeoma looked up, startled, her face turning pale as she realized that Chidi knew everything. For a moment, there was only silence between them, thick with unspoken words and years of hidden guilt. Ijeoma finally spoke, her voice shaky and filled with regret. "Chidi, it wasn't supposed to happen this way." Tears welled in her eyes and she reached out to him, but Chidi stepped back, his heart too broken to accept her apology. "How could you do this to me, to us?" Chidi's voice cracked with emotion, but he refused to let the tears fall. Ijeoma looked down, ashamed, unable to meet her son's eyes as the weight of her actions settled in. Chidi turned away, his chest heaving with emotion as the silence between them grew unbearable. "I trusted you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but the weight of his words was heavy with betrayal. Bijoma stood up, reaching out for him, but Chidi pulled away, the pain too deep for words. He stormed out of the house, leaving his mother alone in the suffocating silence of her guilt. Chidi walked through the quiet streets of the town, his mind racing with the weight of the secrets he carried. As he wandered aimlessly, he found himself standing outside of Bina's house, torn between telling his friend the truth or continuing to bear the burden of home. Chidi took a deep breath and raised his hand to knock on the door, but before he could, a flood of doubt washed over him. His hand hovered in the air, trembling, as he questioned whether revealing the truth would destroy his friendship with Obina forever. Just as Chidi was about to turn away, the door creaked open, and Obina stood there, smiling, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Chidi, what's up, man? Come in." Obina's cheerful voice pierced through Chidi's troubled thoughts. Chidi forced a smile and stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest as he struggled to keep up the facade. They sat together, and Obina chatted about everyday life, completely unaware of the storm raging inside Chidi. Chidi nodded along, barely listening, his thoughts consumed by the betrayal and the decision he would eventually have to make. Obina laughed, oblivious to the weight of the secret Chidi carried. As the tension in the room grew heavier with each passing second, Chidi could barely focus on the conversation, his thoughts consumed by the betrayal and the question of how much longer he could keep it to himself. As Obina laughed, Chidi clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on him. Chidi's chest tightened, and he knew he couldn't stay any longer. The truth was suffocating him. He abruptly stood up, startling Obina, who looked at him in confusion, unaware of the storm raging inside his friend. I need to go, Chidi muttered, avoiding Obina's concerned gaze as he headed for the door. Obina stood up, puzzled, asking, Is everything okay, bro? Chidi paused for a moment, wanting to spill everything. But the words wouldn't come out, so he simply nodded and said, I'm fine. He walked out, the weight of his secret pressing down on him as the door closed behind him. As Chidi walked through the quiet night streets, the weight of the secret seemed to crush him, making each step heavier than the last. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself much longer, but the thought of confronting both families filled him with dread. Chidi reached home, but instead of going inside, he stood outside, staring up at the sky, wondering how things had spiraled so far out of control. The weight of the truth pressed on him, but he still couldn't figure out the right way to confront the people he cared about most. With a deep breath, Chidi finally went inside, deciding that tomorrow he would confront his mother once more and get the answers he desperately needed. But as he lay in bed that night, sleep refused to come, and his mind kept racing with the possibilities of how everything could fall apart. The next morning, Chidi woke with a sense of dread, knowing that the confrontation with his mother could no longer be avoided. He found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as if nothing was wrong. But the weight of their last conversation still hung heavily in the air. Chidi approached her, his heart pounding, and asked, We need to talk. Ijoma froze, her hand stopping mid-motion, knowing the conversation she had been dreading was finally here. Chidi sat down at the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared himself to confront her once again. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? He asked, his voice steady but filled with hurt. Ijeoma sat down across from him, her eyes filled with regret. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I could keep it from you. Her voice trembled, and Chidi could see the guilt weighing heavily on her. But it didn't ease the pain he felt. Chidi clenched his fists under the table, trying to stay calm, but the anger and betrayal were too much to contain. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed Dad, Chidi said, his voice cracking as the weight of his words filled the room. Ijoma lowered her head, tears spilling from her eyes as she whispered, I loved him. I never wanted to hurt either of you. Chidi shook his head, unable to process her words, the pain too fresh and overwhelming. Ijoma watched him leave the kitchen, her heart heavy with regret, knowing that the damage between them would take time to heal. Chidi stepped outside, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside him. As he stood outside, Chidi realized that no matter how hard he tried, things would never be the same between him and his mother. The betrayal had cut too deep, and even though he still loved her, he didn't know if he could ever fully forgive her. Chidi slowly walked away from the house, unsure of what his next steps would be, but knowing that nothing could undo the damage that had been done. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village as Chidi disappeared into the fading light, his heart heavy with uncertainty. As Chidi walked through the village, he thought about his father and the life they had once shared, a time when everything felt stable and whole. Now that life seemed distant, replaced by a web of lies and betrayal that he never could have imagined. Chidi knew he couldn't live in the past, but moving forward felt impossible with the weight of the betrayal still fresh. As he continued walking, he realized that he had to find a way to confront both Emeka and Obina, no matter how difficult it would be. The next day, Chidi gathered the courage to visit Emeka's home, his heart racing as he knocked on the door, unsure of what he would say. When the door opened, Emeka stood there, surprised to see Chidi, but unaware of the confrontation that was about to unfold. Chidi swallowed hard, his palms sweaty as he tried to find the words. I know about you and my mother, he said, his voice low but firm. Emeka's expression changed instantly, his surprise turning into fear as the weight of Chidi's words hit him. Chidi's eyes burned with anger as he stepped closer. How could you betray my father like this? He demanded, his voice rising. Emeka stumbled over his words, guilt etched across his face as he struggled to find an explanation. Never meant for it to go this far, Emeka stammered, his voice shaking with fear and regret. Chidi clenched his fists, struggling to control the fury inside him. You didn't just betray my father, you betrayed your own family. Emeka looked down, unable to meet Chidi's eyes, the shame and guilt too heavy to bear. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Chidi's voice trembled with emotion. You ruined everything. How can you live with yourself? Emeka finally looked up, his eyes filled with tears. I don't expect forgiveness, Chidi. I only hope one day you can find peace. Chidi stood in silence, his heart torn between anger and the desire for closure, unsure of how to respond. Emeka stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Chidi's silence suffocating him, as if his very soul was being judged. Finally, Chidi spoke, his voice cold and distant. I may never forgive you, but I need answers. Emeka sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping as he realized there was no escaping the truth. It started after your father passed away, he began, his voice barely a whisper. Chidi's fists clenched at his sides, bracing himself for the painful confession that was about to follow. It was a mistake. I never meant for it to go this far, Emeka continued, his voice trembling with regret. Chidi's face remained emotionless, but inside he was boiling with anger. Each word from Emeka like salt in a wound. I should have stopped it, but Emeka hesitated, unable to finish his sentence, the weight of his actions too heavy to bear. Chidi took a deep breath, his voice low but filled with anger. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed my father. Emeka's shoulders sagged under the weight of Chidi's words. I know, he whispered, barely able to meet Chidi's eyes. Chidi clenched his fist tighter, struggling to hold back the surge of emotions threatening to break free. Why her? Why my mother? Emeka took a deep breath, his voice shaking. I don't have an excuse, Chidi. It just happened and I was weak. Chidi's jaw tightened as he stepped closer, his anger palpable. Weak? You call betraying your best friend and family weak? Emeka shook his head, his voice breaking. I can't justify what I did. I failed your father, your family, and myself. Chidi's eyes narrowed, his voice low and filled with hurt. Then why did you keep doing it? Emeka took a deep breath, his eyes filling with tears. I don't know. I was selfish. I didn't think about the consequences. Chidi stepped back, shaking his head in disbelief. You destroyed everything. Emeka hung his head, unable to speak, the weight of his guilt rendering him silent. Chidi's heart raced, his anger mixing with a deep sadness as he realized nothing could undo what had been done. Chidi's fists unclenched, but the weight in his chest remained. I can't look at you the same way ever again, he whispered. Emeka wiped his eyes, his voice barely audible. I understand. I'm so sorry, Chidi. Chidi turned away, unable to bear looking at Emeka any longer. I need time and space, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Without waiting for a response, Chidi walked away, leaving Emeka standing alone, consumed by guilt and regret. Chidi walked through the village, his mind racing with everything that had happened, unsure of how to move forward. The weight of the betrayal, the lies, and the pain felt unbearable, and yet he knew he had to find a way to live with it. As Chidi continued to walk, he saw Obinna in the distance, laughing with a group of friends, completely unaware of the storm brewing in Chidi's heart. Chidi hesitated, unsure if he could face his friend, knowing the painful truth about their fathers. Chidi took a deep breath, trying to gather the strength to approach Obinna. But the thought of shattering his friend's world weighed heavily on him. For a moment he considered walking away, leaving Obinna in blissful ignorance, but he knew the truth would come out. Eventually, Chidi clenched his fists, deciding that Obinna needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed their friendship forever. Chidi walked through the village, his mind racing with thoughts of how to tell Obinna the truth. Each step felt heavier as he wondered how his friend would react. As he approached Obinna's usual hangout, he spotted him laughing with friends, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Chidi hesitated, his heart pounding as he considered walking away, but he knew the truth had to come out. With a deep breath, he approached Obina, his face tense and his mind racing with the words he needed to say. Obina, we need to talk, Chidi said, voice barely masking the tension simmering beneath. Obina's smile faltered as he looked at his friend's face, noticing the seriousness. What's wrong, man? You look like you've seen a ghost. Chidi hesitated, the words struggling to escape his lips. It's about your dad and my mom, he finally said, Obina's brow furrowed in confusion. What about them? He asked, sensing something was terribly wrong. Chidi clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. Your dad, he's been having an affair with my mom, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Obina's face twisted in shock and disbelief. What? That's impossible, he blurted, his voice rising. Chidi nodded, his face serious. It's true. I didn't want to believe it either, but I've seen it with my own eyes. Obina's hands balled into fists, his expression shifting from shock to anger. How could you not tell me sooner? Chidi's face tightened. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought it would destroy you. Obina stepped closer, his voice trembling with anger. You think it's better I find out now, after all this time? Chidi's fists clenched again, his frustration boiling over. What was I supposed to do, Obina? It's not like this was easy for me. Obina shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. Easy? You've been hiding this while our whole lives have been a lie. Chidi stepped back, his frustration turning into sadness. I didn't ask for this. I never wanted this. Obina's fist shook as he took a step closer. Maybe you didn't, but now we're both in this mess. Chidi's sadness turned to rage as he stepped forward again. I'm not the one who caused this mess. It's your father. Obina's eyes flashed with fury. Don't you dare blame my father for this. Chidi clenched his fists, ready to lash out. Your father betrayed my family, Obina. He deserves all the blame. Before Obina could respond, the anger between them boiled over, and both men lunged at each other, fists flying. The fight between Chidi and Obina quickly escalated, with neither man willing to back down, each punch fueled by rage and betrayal. Villagers nearby began to gather, shocked by the violent brawl between the two friends, unsure of how to intervene. Chidi, breathing heavily, finally broke free from Obina's grip, his face contorted with rage. I'll make sure your father pays for this, he shouted. Obina, struggling to stand, yelled back, You'll regret this, Chidi. You're the one who's going to pay. Chidi stormed off, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. Tonight, Emeka will pay for everything, he muttered under his breath. As he walked away, Obina, still seething, began plotting his own revenge, determined to make Chidi pay for what he had done. That night, Chidi gathered the knife he had hidden away, his heart pounding as he prepared to carry out his plan against Emeka. Meanwhile, Obina gathered his friends, determined to find Chidi and end things once and for all. Chidi made his way to Emeka's house, his footsteps silent as he approached, knife in hand, ready to end the source of his pain. At the same time, Obina and his friends rushed through the village, searching for Chidi, each step driven by fury. Chidi sneaked into Emeka's house, his heart pounding in his chest as he made his way to the bedroom where Emeka was sleeping. As he raised the knife ready to strike, the door creaked, waking Chidi's mother, who had been lying beside Emeka, and she screamed in terror. Chidi froze in horror as his mother screamed, her voice echoing through the house. Stop! Emeka is your father, she cried out, her words piercing the silence. The knife slipped from Chidi's hands, his world crashing down around him as the devastating truth sank in. Meanwhile, Obina, hearing the scream, rushed to Emeka's house, his heart pounding in terror as he burst through the door. Obina's eyes widened in horror as he saw his father lying in a pool of blood. Chidi standing frozen beside the bed, his mother screaming uncontrollably. Shocked and overwhelmed, Obina and his friends stood still, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding before them the next day. Chidi was dragged away by the police, his face pale and expressionless as the weight of his actions settled in. At Emeka's burial, Chidi's mother stood beside Obina, both of them devastated and broken, the weight of their shared grief too heavy to bear. Chidi sat alone in his prison cell, staring blankly at the walls, knowing that the consequences of that night would haunt him forever.
Moral of the story, do not let anger consume you. Wait, think, and act wisely.